Boas-vindas ao projeto Arte como Ciência. Welcome to Art as Science Project. Hoje, nós vamos ter uma edição especial do Arte como Ciência, contando com a norte-americana Kathy Perkins. Today, we are going to have a special meeting with Kathy Perkins. Por causa disso, a primeira pessoa que vai falar aqui hoje é o Clayton Echeveste, que é o nosso coordenador de tradução solidária. E ele vai explicar em inglês para as pessoas como é que elas vão fazer para entrar na sala de tradução. Então, o pessoal que fala português também entra na sala de tradução de inglês que está aqui embaixo. Vou pedir para o Clayton para ele explicar direitinho, primeiro em inglês, porque a gente vai falar o início, alguns serviços em português, e aí depois ele vai falar em português, como que as pessoas fazem para acessar a sala de tradução solidária. E também, se hablas espanhol, el enlace está abajo, el enlace para la sala de traducción. Clayton Echeveste, por favor.
Olá, boas-vindas a todos e todas ao Arte como Ciência. Good evening, everyone, to Art as Science Project. Today, interviewing North American researcher Kathy Perkins. We are glad to have two translation rooms into English and into Spanish. You can join these, if needed, you can join these rooms through the links below. You find in the description of the video. All right? Any doubts, please send us a message via chat, okay?
Well, just let me explain something. Sure. That people, you can you can watch on YouTube with muted, and you are going to listen the Google meeting, right?
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Vivi. That's right. You have this translation, so into English and into Spanish, right? If needed. Nós temos, então, essa tradução através dos links que estão colocados na descrição do vídeo. Você vai assistir os vídeos, a entrevista pelo YouTube e a tradução através da sala específica de inglês ou de espanhol que está na descrição do vídeo. Certo? Muito obrigado. Uma ótima entrevista. Thank you so much. Have a nice interview.
Obrigada, Clayton. Então, pessoal que quiser acessar a sala, deixa o vídeo, assiste o vídeo mutado, né? E, ao mesmo tempo, deixa o Google Meeting aberto para escutar a tradução que o Celso Júnior e a Paula Cabreira vão estar fazendo para a gente, respectivamente, em inglês e espanhol. Obrigada, Clayton. Bom, o Arte como Ciência, como todo mundo já sabe, é um projeto que procura discutir o papel social da arte. E por isso nós convidamos artistas que trabalham na intersecção da sua prática com a reflexão sobre o seu trabalho. E hoje nós vamos ter o prazer e a alegria de contar com a querida Kathy Perkins. E por isso essa entrevista, a partir de agora, vai ser em inglês, mas no final a gente faz o fechamento em português também. Então, boas-vindas a Kathy Perkins.
Olá!
Hello, Kathy! Thank you very much for being here in the Art as Science Project.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are so glad. Well, it's a very special day for us. Thank you for being part of the Art as Science Project. Today, we will speak about your remarkable work concerning anthologies of African and African diaspora plays by women. However, before we focus directly on this issue, I think it would be fantastic if you could share with us your personal history, since I believe it is very inspiring and connected to the choices you made as a professor and researcher.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Mobile, Alabama. Mobile is a seaport town on the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm like right at the Gulf of Mexico near Florida. And I grew up during the era of civil rights, segregation in the South. And I grew up in a very close-knit community. I had wonderful teachers, advisors, Sunday school people at church, community organizations, and of course my parents. And they really inspired us to do well. I mean, it was sort of a given that you were brought up in that community to do well, and people expected great things from you. And so I'm one of 5 children, and we were always active in the arts in some form or fashion. I would sing, play piano. My sister was a pianist, and in fact, she majored in music. And, you know, either in the church plays or high school or junior high school plays, I was always involved in something artistic. And so when I decided to go to college, going into drama was sort of a natural thing to do. I knew that was what I wanted to do. And so I went to Howard University, which is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. And Howard was known for having one of the best theater programs in the country. I mean, it still does. And so I went there, and my idea was to become an actress. You know, I thought I was great. You know, I thought I was going to be a wonderful actress. And my first year at Howard, as a freshman, first year student, you're required to work in all areas of the theater. So that's lighting, doing costume, doing scenery. And so I was assigned to do lighting for a show. I was hanging and focusing the lights. And my best friend, who was a second year student ahead of me, we were sitting backstage, and he said, what are you going to do with a degree in acting? And I was sort of offended. I said, I'm going to go to Broadway and be a star. What else? What do you think I'm going to do? And he said, I've seen you hang lights, and you're pretty good at lighting. And he said in so many words, I don't think you're a good actress. And he said, why don't you think about doing lighting? He says, we don't have enough Black people in that area. And I think you'd be good in that area, and you will always work. You know, too many actors can't find jobs, but if you do lighting, you will always work. And so I took him up on his offer. Also at Howard, we had what was called a touring house. It was like a big theater where groups would come in, like concert artists, major speakers and stuff like that. And so I had a chance to work there, and I made a lot of money. So that was an incentive too. But I was also designing in my theater department. So between my work as a student in the theater department and my working in the touring house, I was exposed to a lot of practical experience in lighting. And I fell in love with it. It became a passion. And I did well, and my advisors were very, very supportive and encouraging. And the guy who ran the touring house, he was like one of my major mentors. And when I decided to go to grad school, they just supported me and helped me put a portfolio together. And so, after 4 years at Howard, I went to graduate school at Michigan and got my MFA in lighting there. So, which was also a wonderful experience. It was a great program at Michigan.
Whoa. Wow. As a light designer, you have been traveling all around the world. How are these experiences connected to the choices you made on creating the proposals of the anthologies you have organized?
Oh, wow. That's a long answer. First, my anthologies began with just African American women. And then I didn't really start to travel until when I went to Africa for the first time in 1995. Right out of graduate school in 1978, I worked in New York City. I worked with the dance company. And then I was also working with, this was the period of apartheid was still in full swing. And there were a lot of South African exiles living in New York City who were artists. And so I was dating a guy from Somalia, and he knew a lot of South Africans. And then my sister also knew some South Africans. So somehow there was this connection with us, and I began to light a lot of their shows. They were like all over Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx. So I was just all over New York City. And I realized all the plays and the musicals and the dance concerts I did with them, they were all by men, directed by men. Everything was run by men. And I always wondered, well, where are the women? I'm sure there must be South African women who write. And so it wasn't until 1995 that I went to Africa for the first time, and it was to South Africa because that was the place I knew the most about. And so I didn't go there with the intention of doing a collection of plays on, South African women. But while I was there, they knew about the book on Black women I was doing. They started saying, oh, well, can you help us get published? And so that's how the whole thing with South Africa got started. And each time I would go to South Africa, somebody would say, oh, you should go to Uganda, or you should go to Zimbabwe. Or, so I just kept going to different countries each time I go to South Africa. And then I became interested in what women around the continent were writing about. And so that's how that began. And a lot of times I would go to countries to talk about my work that I was doing here in the United States. And while I was there, I would be lighting shows. And then I would get to meet all these amazing women who were, well, they didn't call themselves playwrights. They called themselves storytellers, or they called themselves writers. I would meet a lot of women who would, if they felt poetry was the best way to express themselves, they would say, I'm a poet. If they thought a novel was the best way to express themselves, they would say, I'm a novelist right now. But rarely did they just say, I am strictly a playwright. I found that the women did, multiple areas of writing. So it's really South Africa that got me interested in, women throughout Africa and the diaspora.
Oh, it's amazing. And well, you have been a professor for many years. You are currently Professor Emerita from both the University of Illinois and the University of North Carolina. How your experiences at the university are connected to the anthologies you held?
It's interesting because I think it was my later anthologies, I was encouraged to do those because I was teaching. Because a lot of times I would be teaching a course and I would say, oh, I wish I had a play for these students to read about this. And then I said, oh, why don't I put together my own collection of plays? And another book I published, this one was called Contemporary Plays by Women of Color. These were African-American, Native Americans, Latinx, and Asian American playwrights. And that particular book came about as a result of, I have a good friend who's Asian American, Japanese American. We taught in the same area. I used to teach at Smith, she was at UMass, and then I moved to Illinois to teach. And we were always exchanging plays. She said, oh, do you have a good African American play? And I would say, oh, do you have a good Asian American play for me to teach? And we just decided one day, it's like, look, no one has ever done a collection of plays just on American women of color. And so we got together and just found some of our favorite plays. And then we started putting a call out to other people that were looking for these plays. And the book came about. And it was a very, I would say, one of our most successful anthologies because, it was great because either people would find a book just on African-American women or just on Asian American women, Native American or Latinx, but not in one collection. So that's how that book came about. And like I said, a lot of times the anthologies would come up about because I felt that there was a need and there were certain stories that were not being told. And I wanted, these stories to be out there, these women's voices to be heard.
Yeah, it is really, really impressive. How many anthologies have you launched? Could you please talk a little bit about each book? I know that it's too much.
Okay, this is the first one. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Black Female Playwrights. This was my very first anthology, which was published in 1989. And I had never published before. I never thought of myself as a scholar. And the book came about because, my whole interest in research came about my very first day of graduate school. This is in 1976 at the University of Michigan. And I was on my way trying to find the orientation for lighting designers or for design majors. And I stopped this young white guy in the hallway and I said, "Can you tell me where the design orientation is?" And he said, "The actors are over there." And I said, well, maybe he didn't understand me. I said, "I'm looking for the designers." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I'm a design major." And he looked at me, he said, "Well, I didn't know Black people did anything other than perform." And he wasn't being funny. He was very, very serious. Remember, this is 1976. And I said, "That's not true." I said, "I just graduated from Howard, which is a historically Black college. And 90% of the people I worked with were, or maybe 99% of the people I worked with were Black people. So I know they're designers and you're looking at one." And so I thanked him. And because I had to go, I didn't want to be late. And what was interesting, he said during our short conversation, he said, "Well, I have a PhD in theater and I've never read anything about Black people behind the scenes." And I just remember throughout the whole day during my orientation, I was so angry at what he said. So after my orientation, I guess it was around 5 or 6, I went to go have dinner. And then I went to the library. And University of Michigan has a very extensive theater library. And I must have been there till about 1 in the morning. And what I discovered was this young man was right. We didn't exist. There was very little about Black people behind the scenes. One was in a book about the 1940s when the US had what was called a federal theater run by the government. And then there was a book by a Black historian who wrote, just had a very small section about Blacks behind the scenes. And that frustrated me even more. And I just remember going home, calling my sister that night. My sister was working on her PhD in education. And I called her and I said, "This is what happened today. I'm so angry. I don't know what to do." And she says, "Well, you need to write a book." And I said, "Well, I'm not a scholar. I don't know how to write." And she said, "Well, if you don't do this, these stories won't get recorded, or we won't know the history of these people." And she said, "What you need to do is start with all the people you work with in Washington, D.C., and they'll tell you about other people, and one thing will lead to another." And which was true, but it wasn't until almost 4 years later that I really began to do the research on, Blacks behind the scenes. It started out mainly with designers. I didn't really focus on women playwrights until later. Someone always has to make me angry, at least in my early years for me to do a project. I was at a conference and it was a conference on women playwrights. And there was a very prominent scholar who made a comment about Lorraine Hansberry. For those of you all who don't know Lorraine Hansberry, she was the first Black woman to have a show on Broadway. And this was in 1959. And so this woman said, "Oh, Lorraine Hansberry was the first Black woman playwright." And I just said, "What? I can't believe she said that." Because there had been a book out that had a whole section on Black women playwrights from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. And so I just said, "This is unbelievable." And then I'd gone to another panel and another prominent scholar basically said there were no real women writing anything before Hansberry. And so I remember sharing this with my sister and she says, "Oh, well, you have another book project to work on." And so around 1981, I was able to get some funding from the Ford Foundation to really start on my research project. So I was doing designers and I was doing the Black women playwrights. But around 1985, around 86, I decided I really wanted to do the book on women playwrights. So, and I wanted to do early women playwrights. So 2 of my major advisors, they were both renowned. They had written a lot in theater and I had so much respect for them. I went to the first one, his name was Dr. Jim Hatch. And I said, oh, Jim, I want to do this book on Black women playwrights. And, you know, I'm not a writer. Will you be my co-editor? And he said, of course not. He said, you need to do this by yourself, because if I co-edit with you, no one knows who you are. You know, they know who I am. And so I will get all the credit for it. And so I thanked him for that. And then I went to my other advisor and I said, you know, Dr. Wilkerson, I want to do this book project. Would you be my co-editor? And she said, of course not. She says, people know me. And if I do something with you, I'm going to overshadow. I'm going to get all the credit. And that made sense. But what she did say, and I really appreciate that to this day, she said, look, I did a book, and she had written a book on the first collection of plays, anthology on Black women, but her plays were after 1950. She says, why don't you do a collection of plays on Black women before 1950? And it could be like a companion piece to my book. And she even helped me find, you know, she gave me advice on how to find a publisher. You know, what's the difference between a commercial publisher versus an academic publisher. So I had the two of them to really think. And so then I just spent the next couple of years just going to research centers, going to families, looking for plays by women before 1950. Many of them had not been published. And it wasn't until I was in Washington, D.C., which is where I went to school at Howard. And Howard has a huge research library. So a lot of the Black women who had written during that period, many of them were in the Washington, D.C. area. So Howard had this wealth of information files at their research center. And then while I was there, I was speaking to a professor at Howard who had written about early Black women. And I was asking about some of the women from the 1920s. And I asked about this woman named Mae Miller. And she says, you can go and talk to Mae Miller. She's alive. And I'm thinking, what? And I said, if this woman's alive, she's got to be almost 90, which she was. I think she may have been 80s, late 80s. And so I went and spoke with Mae Miller, and we hit it off. We became very good friends. And she was so instrumental in doing my very first anthology. And I have to say, I did the anthology like in a record time because like I was in no hurry, because where I taught, I only need to do lighting. So doing the books was just something that I just did on my own time. But because she was elderly, and because many of the women in the book, well, actually all the women in the book she knew, you know, they had been friends, they had gone to school together. And she even helped me pick some of the playwrights. But the thing is that made me get the book done so quickly was the fact that I made the mistake of telling her that I go to bed late at night. So I said, oh, you can call me anytime you want to. So over the next couple of months, she would call me at 2:00 in the morning, and I knew it was her. And she said, this is Mae. Well, you know, I have heart trouble, and you need to hurry up and get this book done before I die. So, yes. So that's why I got that first book done so quickly, because I would have nightmares at nighttime. It's like, oh my God, if this woman dies before I finish this book, I'll never forgive myself. So she would call. This was like on a weekly basis. Well, is the book done? It's like, no, I got to find a publisher first. And then I had to hurry up and find a publisher. But anyway, it was published before she passed, and I made a special trip to Washington, D.C. to put it in her hand. And when I got to University of Illinois, they produced one of her plays, and she was too frail to come and see it. But we videotaped it. No, we videotaped it and sent her a copy, and she was just so touched. We did 3 plays from the anthology. So, like I said, everybody in the book, you know, she knew them. They were friends. So, so that was a really high point in my life when I was able to finish this collection of plays. So, and that one was done in '89. You want me to talk about each one? Is that what you said?
Yeah, if you can.
Okay.
They are amazing. I have read some.
Okay. I'm not going to go in order, but one of my favorite stories is this is a book, Alice Childress. She was a famous, African-American playwright starting in the 50s. I mean, she had like a 50-year career as a playwright from like the 50s through 94 when she died. And she's very well known. Well, she's becoming more well known to a new generation. And I did this collection of plays on her in 2011. And no one had ever anthologized her work. You know, she had a play in this collection, a play in that collection, but no one had ever anthologized her work before. But anyway, to make a long story short, I had the pleasure of working with Alice Childress in 1984. She was doing a premiere of a play with music. She didn't call it a musical, called Gullah. And this was when I was working at Smith in Massachusetts. And so I got to be the lighting designer on the show, which I was really thrilled about. And we became, I would say, good friends. And we had a very good relationship from at least for 10 years, up until the time she died, because I met her in 84 and she died in 1994. So she lived in New York City. And usually when I would come to New York City, I would try and at least stop by and see her, or at least call her or something like that. So I will never forget, this was in 1989 when my first book came out on the early Black women playwrights. I called her and I said, "Oh, I'm in town." And she said, "Come by." I said, "Yeah, I have a surprise. I want to give you something." And so I went to her house and I held out the book. I said, "Here's my very first book." And she looked at it and she says, "Oh, Black women writers before 1950. This is very interesting." And so she started flipping through the titles of the plays. And she said, "You know, I wrote my very first play in 1949, don't you?" And it was like, well, why am I not in this play? This is before 1950. My play was 1949. And I just didn't know what to say. I don't lie very well, and I don't think quickly on my feet like some people, but I knew I had to come up with something fast to say. And I said, "Oh, Miss Childress, you know, the person you're of the caliber, you should have a collection of plays on your own." And so that's how this anthology eventually came up. And she said, "Oh, okay, well, great. When do we start?" She was so flattered by my saying that. And it was like, "Well, when do we start?" But, you know, I didn't get a chance to start the anthology before she died. It was like almost 20 years later that I was able to do this anthology. So I'm very happy I did it. Like I said, no one has done a collection of her work before. And so I was very honored to do it. I'm just sorry I didn't do it before she passed. Go ahead.
I have the opportunity to watch a play by her. It was Imagine with You. Yes, you were the light designer, and Sandra Dell was the director.
Yes.
And the name is Trouble in Mind.
Yes.
And it's I need to tell you that it was a great opportunity for me. It make me think till now, because she has a very smart point of view on putting a white director directing Black people talking about a Black situation.
And it was a white playwright too. It was a white playwright and a white director.
Yeah, so it is really interesting. It's very smart. So I would like you to speak a little bit about this play, if you could tell us.
Yeah, Trouble in Mind. It takes place in the 50s. No, in the 50s, because they talk about the civil rights and they talk about the bombing of the church in Birmingham. So this is in the 50s. So the play it takes place backstage of a Broadway theater, and it's supposedly a Black play written by a white director. It's directed by a white director, and neither of them really know anything about, you know, African American culture. But these are the plays that get produced then and now. And so there's a lynching that takes place in the play. Well, the playwright is created a lynching where this Black mother, gives her son to a lynch mob and say, oh, you did something wrong, son, you should get lynched. But there's an actress, the older Black actress, who's been playing these roles all these years, roles that she hates, but she does it because, she has to eat. She has reached a point where I can't do these kind of plays anymore. And it becomes very problematic because there's a young Black guy who just finished college, and this is his first Broadway show. And he doesn't want this other Black woman to mess things up for him. And then there's another Black woman in the show. It's very hard for Blacks to get a Broadway show. And so they're upset with the other Black woman. Her name is Willetta. They feel that, let's just do the show. It's get the money and go on and don't worry about the politics of it. And then there's an older Black guy in the show. He hasn't done a Broadway show in years. So they're all upset with her because they feel like, you can't tell these white people what to do. But in the end, she, expresses herself and says, look, this Black woman would not say this. And I'm tired of you all telling these false stories about how Black people live and how we think. And then at the end, she decides, well, it's sort of open. She decides she's not going to do this show. Either they're going to fire her or change the show or whatever. And this is sort of based on a true story. When she wrote this play, Alice Childress, they wanted her to have the show a happy ending. They really wanted a happy ending. And when she did change it for the producers at that time, and it's something she said she always regretted doing, that she changed it to make it to appeal to a white audience. The show wasn't on Broadway at the time. It was off Broadway. But she was one of very few Black women who worked off Broadway, who worked professionally in New York. But she did change it for that first major production. And then they wanted to take the show to Broadway, this play to Broadway. And she refused to change it. They wanted her to make the show have a happy ending. And I think she struggled for like 3 or 4 years trying to rewrite the show, and she just said no. So Childress was someone who I really admired, and I was really happy to know her, like I said, the last 10 years of her life, because she had a second play that producers wanted to bring to Broadway. It was about an interracial couple, a Black woman and a white man, and they wanted her to change the story so we see it through the eyes of the white man and not the Black woman. She says, no, this is this particular woman's story. It's not the story of the white man. It's this Black woman's story. And so there was another play that she struggled with, and decided, no, I'm not going to change the play. But what's really interesting, since the death of George Floyd, there's been this big interest in the works of Alice Childress, especially Trouble in Mind, because the issues that Blacks were having with Broadway in the 50s, we're still having them today. A lot of the plays are written by white playwrights, or if they're written by Black playwrights, they're produced primarily by whites. They're designed primarily by whites. And, you may have a Black director and a Black cast, but everything else is controlled by whites. So Trouble in Mind is a very timely play. It's going to Broadway. I'm sorry, Alice Childress won't. It's the play, her original version, one that she wrote, that she wanted. That play is going to Broadway next year. And a lot of theaters are going to be producing it around the country. And so I'm very happy about that. I just wish Alice Childress.
It is fantastic.
Yeah.
I wish I could see it again.
Well, you might.
No, maybe. Who knows? Well, you have lots of books. If you want to tell a little bit about the other ones, it's your choice.
The other one, when I went to, this is called Black South African Women, Black South African Women, an Anthology of Plays. But the plays are about women, but they're written by both men and women, because while I was there, I I just discovered there were some wonderful plays written by men about women. Like I said, when I first went to South Africa, I didn't go there with the intent to, I'm going to do an anthology of plays by, Black South African women. But while I was there and I was lecturing the first year I went, a lot of African women would come up to me and say, we would love to have our stuff published. Can you help us get published? And so I was going to South Africa like 4 years in a row or something like that. So that gave me an opportunity to interview a lot of South African writers and meet them and even design some of their shows. And, I just said there's such a wealth of talent just in South Africa. I just did the book just on Black South African women. And then after that, I started, going around the continent, meeting other African women. And I decided I want to do a collection of plays on women on the continent. And so that's how this one came up, African Women Playwrights. This one I did in 2008. 2008, but it was published in 2009. And I don't know if you can see the artwork that well, but the artist is from Uganda. She's a very well-known artist in Uganda. Oh God, what's her name? Amanda Tumasini. She's a very prominent artist. And so I was very honored that she did the book cover for this. So yeah, the one on African women took a while. It took a long time because, like I said, I was going different places, meeting different women. And one of the first thing I did, and I'm very, very conscious of this, and this was even true with the collection I did on Black South African women, because, I can sometimes be very sensitive, like when, white people want to do something on Black people or whatever. And so I felt that I had to ask permission. It's like, okay, I'm Black, but I'm African American. How do you feel about me doing a collection of work on Black South Africans? And, they were fine with it. And then when I decided to do the book on African women, I said the same thing to the African women. I said, okay, I'm Black, but I'm not African. How do you feel about me doing this book on African women? And in my introduction, I tried to let the women speak for themselves. Even in when I did interviews, the interviews were included in the biography. And then my foreword was written by a very prominent Ugandan scholar who people really respected. And she respected my work. And so I tried to have the women speak for themselves. I wasn't trying to speak for women in Africa or South Africa. So that was important, that they felt comfortable with me as an outsider, as a foreigner, writing about African women. And for most of them, they said, look, if you don't do it, it probably won't get there. And one of the things that the African women made me aware of, and this is very much true in my book, most of the women in the book, all of them except for maybe one, live in Africa, because what they all said was women from Africa that tend to get published tend to live in the UK, the US, Australia. Rarely will they publish a work by a woman who is living in Africa. And usually they want to publish somebody who has a well-known name. One of the women I did publish, her name is Ama Adadu. She's the first African woman to publish a play in English. And I spoke with her. I included her play primarily because at the time she was living 6 months in the US, 6 months in Ghana, which is where she's from. And then I also published another very prominent playwright named Cici Dingarimba. Her work is known internationally, but she lives in Zimbabwe. And that's the other thing. Editors like to have at least one prominent name to sell the book. So I included Ama Adadu. Well, I want to include her anyway. So that was important because it's very difficult for African women to get their works published. It's very difficult.
Well, Kathy, I have had the opportunity to read this book. It is fantastic. And this introduction with the playwrights showing their histories and the way they struggle to make their works happen is really inspiring. What I would like to know is, how did you find them?
Like I said, when the first time I went to South Africa, I met people there. The trip to South Africa was amazing because I was able to get hooked up with somebody through the State Department, and they arranged it so I could go to theaters, community centers, to the townships, women's groups, and so I met people that way. And it's like one person would lead you to the next person, and when they heard that, oh, this person does theater. Oh, but also during that time, I went in 1995. I mean, Mandela had won in 1994, and things were transitioning a lot in South Africa. And like I said, I had known some South African exiles when I was working in New York. So I reconnected with some of those people because a lot of them went back to South Africa and did extremely well. So I had that connection. And then the next year I ended up going to Zimbabwe. I had a colleague who taught in California, and she would take a bunch of students to Zimbabwe, and they would be at the University of Zimbabwe, and she knew I was going to be in South Africa. And she said, oh, well, why don't you come to Zimbabwe? It's just, a flight away. And I remember spending about 2 weeks with her, and she introduced me to these young scholars at the University of Zimbabwe. And then one of the scholars introduced me to a lot of the artists in, Harare. So, one person led to the next. And then the next year I had a friend who was spending time in Uganda. And so I had a place to stay. And another colleague told me about this woman named Rose Mboa. And she said, oh, if you're going to Uganda, you have to meet Rose Mboa. She's like one of the prominent people in, theater for development or theater for social change. And so I went to Uganda. I met her, and, she introduced me to other people. So, people, they're so welcoming. When they see you coming there for something, they want you to meet everybody. And then I can't remember how I ended up going to Tanzania. And I went to Tanzania one year. I think I went there to do research on a particular woman. And so, I went there to do some lighting workshops. And so while I was there, everything bleeds into the other. If I'm doing lighting workshop, I end up dealing with, playwrights. If I'm dealing with playwrights, I end up doing lighting. And so I end up doing something in Tanzania, and I developed a relationship with the community there. And then, I went to Kenya. Someone in Tanzania said, oh, you got to go meet these people in Kenya. And then I went to Ghana because there's a big Pan-African theater festival there. And then, so I just started meeting people. And I'm one of these people, I don't have a problem going up to folks and saying, oh, I hear you're a writer, blah, blah, blah. And usually they're happy to talk with you. I mean, people want to network. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, it took a while. So I was going across the continent. I wasn't able to get anything from Ethiopia because it's very hard to translate Amharic. I mean, that's the only language they speak in Ethiopia because they were never colonized. So it was hard to get something. It wasn't that many women playwrights in Ethiopia at the time I went. So I wasn't successful in getting anything from there. So most of the countries are from Anglophone speaking countries, except for one country. I have a play from the Cameroon, and that was because the young lady is bilingual. She knew English and French. So
Wow.
that was the African playwrights. And then I did a collection of plays on lynching, which is a very, popular topic. I mean, it's, people are talking about it more and more now because now we have this museum in Alabama. They call it the Lynching Museum, but it has a different name. People refer to it as a lynching museum. And so there's been a lot of talk about lynching. And this book I did in 1998. This particular book came about because a colleague of mine became interested in the topic. She had read some of the early plays about women and lynching, because the very first book I did, many of these plays deal with the topic of lynching, particularly in the 20s and 30s. And so she wanted to pursue doing a collection of plays just on lynching. And originally it was going to be on American playwrights, Black men, white women, Black women, everybody. And she asked me if I would be a co-editor with her. And I just said, okay, sure, that's a topic I'm interested in. And as we began researching, looking for lynching plays, we found that there were hundreds of plays on lynching. And then we decided, why don't we just narrow it down to Black and white women? And so that's what this collection is. Many of these plays had never been published. They were at schools, they were in research centers, they were in people's homes, but we were just astounded by the number of plays dealing with the topic of lynching. And so, like I said, we just focused on women and did this play. And a lot of the plays start from 1916 with the play called Rachel up through the 90s, because we did this in 1998. Yeah. So they were contemporary up to contemporary times. So this is a special book. It's strictly on plays dealing with the topic of lynching. So that I co-edited, and like I said, I don't think I showed you that this is the one that my colleague, the Japanese American woman, we did on contemporary plays by women of color. And this was done in the 90s too. Like I said, there had never been a collection of plays that just focused on the 4 different ethnic groups in this women: Asian American, African American, Latinx, and Latinx, and Native American, Asian American, and African American. So we did that one. So that's those 6 books. And this morning, as I mentioned to you earlier, because of COVID, and I had this time to work on this, I've been working on another collection of plays around the theme of home. And this is a collection of 12 plays by women and one man from 10 different countries on we're looking at a very home in a very, very broad term. And I first got the idea for doing this back in 2014, because during that time, there was a lot of people being, displaced around the country. You were talking about Syria. You're talking about what was happening in South America, Haiti, people moving about because of famine in different parts of Africa. And so I just started thinking about the home. And you would hear people talking about, I need to get home, or I need to move away to another home to find a better home. And then I was listening. There was a lot of abuse. I mean, not that it never happened, but you were hearing more about it. Women being abused in the home, and children being abused. And I just started thinking, God, what is, home? How the term kept resonating. But what I did, in 2016, I decided I wanted to do a festival around the theme of home, telling our stories of home. And I did this here at University of North Carolina. And it wasn't just, the focus was on women from Africa and the African diaspora. So it was people in literature. So we brought in novelists, poets, playwrights. We brought in dancers. We covered so much that dealt with around the theme of home. Healthcare. We brought in a physician from the Sudan who told us that, most people think malaria was the biggest killer for African women. It was a certain type of cancer that she says that's killing people. Don't get me to lying, so I won't say which one it is. So we talked about healthcare. We also looked at Muslim women throughout, in Africa and in the US. So it's just so many topics dealing with home, because, there's not a lot of discussion. You start talking about home life of Muslim women. So we talked about, and then we talked about the criminal justice system. We brought in a young woman who had served 5 years in prison. And then, we did one on the criminal justice system. And then we did a whole thing on women in the Caribbean. There was about 12 different kinds of panels. It was a 2-week event. It was a big event. So I was very proud of that. We brought in a dancer from Brazil. She might be online. I hope so. Yes, and she did a piece on home. But whatever the piece was, it had to focus around the theme of something about home from where you are. And one of the high points of the festival was I brought in two women who were cities. And a lot of people aren't familiar with the cities. These are Africans who have been in India for like over, some say almost 800 years. They were brought there either as slaves by the British and Portuguese. Some say they were also brought there as soldiers to guard the castles of the Europeans. But they're a small group of people. They live along the coast of India, and they live in the forest. And once they're outside of their community, they're very mistreated. I don't know if you're familiar with the untouchables in India. These people are below the untouchables. And they're, you know, they can be beaten on the street. They're really discriminated against only because they are thought of as Africans. They're treated as Africans in a very negative way. But these people, these cities, the only place they know, the only home they know of is India. You know, they eat Indian food, they speak the Indian languages. Some of the African traditions have been passed down in some of their dancing and their music, but, you know, they cannot trace their roots back to their African ancestors. Now they've been doing DNA testing to say, oh, this group of people may have come from Tanzania or from Kenya, but they're a very unique group of people in India. And it's one of India's best kept secrets. They don't even want you to know about them. But I can't remember where I first read about them. And I decided I really wanted to find some city women to bring to this event. Because anytime you read up about them, they're always talking about them being in the forest, being in the jungle, you know, being illiterate and blah, blah, blah. And so I had a friend, Indian friend, who was at UCLA, because I'd written something for him in an Indian journal. And I called him, I said, look, this might be impossible, but I'm looking for some city women who perform or write or something. And he was able to put me in touch with somebody who knew somebody that knew two city women. So there was an Indian guy, I guess, you know, an Indian, who was married to a city woman, and his wife had a sister who was studying to get her PhD. It was the first time a city woman was, I think she'll be the first city woman to have a PhD in India, at least in theater. And so I found them, I told them what I was going to do, and they came to this festival. And I was just really excited to have them here. And they were just excited to be here. So they're going to be in this book. They're not playwrights, they're storytellers. So theirs will be like the only story, but it can be performed. So I have for this collection, this collection of plays, I'm very happy about the women and the one man that I found thanks to Viviane. And I want to congratulate you on introducing me to the Brazilian collection of plays. Negro Brazil, is that?
Dramaturgia Negra, Black Dramaturgy.
Okay, yeah, so I don't speak Portuguese, but she translated one of the plays. I mean, she gave me a synopsis of each of the plays, and one of the plays I just fell in love with. It's written by a man, but I say this is such a powerful play about this woman living under the Atlantic Ocean who was thrown from a slave ship. I say this is such a unique play that I have to use it, and I have to thank Viviane for translating. I know it's not an easy job.
Yeah, but it was my pleasure to translate this play by Aldri Anunciação, that is a great playwright in Brazil. So I'm honored to be able to translate it, and you can always count on me.
Yes. So I'm very excited about that play. I'm excited about the project in general. So like I said, I've just sent it off to a publisher, to review. You know, I don't have a contract. They're just going to let me know if they're interested or not. But I'm determined to get it. It's going to get published by somebody. So I think it's a really good group of women, and they're all excited to be amongst the other group of women. So we'll see what happens. And most of them are short pieces. Of the 12, 8 of them are only like one characters, and they're short, so they can be performed, you know, in a classroom. And I purposely did that because I would love to do a festival, an actual festival on the theme of home. Well, I guess it'll be Home Part 2, and be able to produce these plays. And because they have very low technical, you know, the minimal requirements technically, they can be easily done if you're in a theater that doesn't have a big budget. And then I was also thinking, after COVID, a lot of theaters just will not have any money to do any big show. Yes. And they'll say, oh, this is a one-woman show. Oh, this is easy. Oh, it's not a lot of scenery. Oh, this will be great. And it's small enough we can take it on a tour. So, you know, I was keeping that in mind as I was looking at the play. So I'm very, very excited about that.
Yeah.
And, yeah. So I've been like virtually globetrotting during COVID, looking for playwrights, you know. So I'm very happy with the group I've found.
Great. I'm looking forward to read this book. Well, it was fantastic listening to you. I had the opportunity to read some of your books. It is impressive to observe the different perspective concerning Black women's themes and how these authors deal with their dilemmas in a very complex way. Without reducing these issues into fake truths, the authors build a critical gaze on the situations and behaviors present in their own communities and actions. There are so many powerful examples: the mutilation and female circumcision, the cultural differences between an Afro community and an Afro-American woman, the brown woman feeling nowhere among black and white, and so many other subjects. What is the importance of dealing with these ideas?
Yeah, for me, it was mainly stories that you don't read about. And like I said, when I do these anthologies, I'm always thinking about my students. And usually, you know, if I'm teaching something, I mean, it's sad to say a lot of young people just don't know anything about history. Not only do they know anything about history, a lot of them don't know anything about other people's cultures. And this I've learned from teaching almost 40 years. I mean, maybe particularly here in America, we're sort of in this sort of closed society. We only think about what goes on here. And that's not all students, but, you know, when I just remember when I was teaching about lynching, many of the Black kids have heard about lynching, but I would have white students just like, this happened in America. And I remember having an Indian student, from India, when she read some of the plays on lynching, she thought it was fiction. And I said, no, this actually happened in America. And some of the plays impacted her so much that she created this amazing painting on lynching. And so a lot of her earlier, she was a scene designer as well as a painter. So a lot of her work began to be focused on, you know, people in pain, the mistreatment of people, you know, just from taking these classes and just reading these stories. And the classes, when I taught, I did a course on African women in theater. And so it was just so much young people did not know. And like the whole issue of female genital mutilation, a lot of people were not even aware that this existed. And the whole thing about in certain countries, how if a woman's husband dies, the family can come in and take over the males, or a brother can come and marry his brother's wife without her permission. And so it was just a lot of things culturally. I mean, you know, Africa's a big continent. So there's so many different cultural traditions. So it's just a lot of things that they didn't know. You know, the whole thing about boys having priority of going to get an education over the women. And in many African countries, you have to pay to go to school. You know, here, you know, kids get free education. It may not be the greatest, but they get free public education. In many places in Africa, you have to pay to go to school, you know, 6 years old, 7 years old. So it was a lot. They learned a lot. And that's what I try to do with the anthologies. One is to teach about cultures. One is to teach about history. And then just to make the voices of these women heard, because as I mentioned, it's very difficult for women in Africa to get published. Like I said, unless they've been in the UK or unless they're in the US or whatever. So I made a very conscious decision that I was not going to publish plays by women in Africa outside of Africa. And pretty much the same thing for this collection. You know, if I want somebody from Brazil, they're in Brazil, they know what's going on, or, you know, they're in their country, you know, they're in Uganda, you know, they're in Venezuela, whatever, or they spend most of their time there. So I'm not looking for somebody who's born in, you know, a country and spent, you know, 50 years in the US, but someone who's still very much tied to the country. And to me, it makes the work sort of authentic, you know, because they are there and they know what's going on. So
Yeah.
I'm very conscious of that.
Well, we always talk about the importance of cultural policies. How do you perceive the connections between the structure people have and the art they are able to build?
I think we were talking about this in terms of representation, how these individuals need to be represented, again, either through the plays. I mean, it's not so much that I just publish these plays, but I like to see these plays produced. And I think theater is one of the greatest media. Well, people say TV and whatever, the internet now, but I think there's something about live theater, you know, seeing people. And I love intimate theater, seeing people close up so you can really feel what's going on. And I don't know, something about live theater that you cannot capture on the movie screen or on the internet. And like I said, you know, I find that people are touched when they see plays. And many times they may see themselves on the stage. And this is an easy way. It's like, yes, that's me. Without me saying my name or this is this person. Because that's one of the things I loved about teaching. And a lot of times I was not teaching theater majors. A lot of times my students were from other areas, which I really love. Like I did a non-Western theater class, and I would say maybe 10% of the students were theater people. So I had kids coming from like the sciences and other areas, which was great because I had such a range of students from various disciplines. And they just really were amazed that, oh, I can learn this from theater. I can read this play about these people and learn so much. But one of the things I did when they, before we would read these plays, I would always give them some type of background. There's this wonderful play. I mean, it's a depressing play. It's called Eclipse, and it's about young women in Liberia. It's during the Liberian Civil War. And it's these group of women who are being used by soldiers as, I don't want to say prostitutes, but I guess, victims of war. And so a lot of students weren't even aware, this is what happens during war, how women become the victim, how they become sexually exploited. And so it was a very hard play to read. But before they read the play, I had them watch like 2 documentaries. One that talked about the Liberian War and how women were they were responsible for ending the Civil War. So they have to have some type of background before they read the play. Again, because many of these students are not theater people. And it's hard for them to, if you're not a real theater person, it's just hard for you to sit there and read a play by yourself. And I would usually encourage, if we had time, we would read them aloud in class. Many times we didn't. So that's why I'm making this next collection of plays, so they're short, so they can be read in class and there'll be time to talk about them. But yeah, my thing about the anthologies is, one, I use it, like I said, to teach young people about the cultures, the history of these different places, and to make the voices of women heard, because, you know, they are just not published as widely as men, or not, or if they're published in very local areas. Because I did find plays by women from Africa, but they were either self-published, and you can only find them, like, you know, in this area of Uganda or in this area of, you know, Ghana or whatever, but they were not circulated on a wider scale. So the women were excited because, oh, this book is being done in the US or the UK, so a lot of people will see it. So
Yeah.
And so that's my goal, is just to get the material out there, you know, to let people know these women are here.
It is fantastic. And before I make my next question, I would like to invite people who are watching us, if they have some questions, please write them in the chat, both in English or in Portuguese or Spanish. So if you want to make any question, the time is now. Well, Kathy, the project Art as Science is based on the idea that awareness about the role of art in the emotional roots that generate values and behaviors is crucial to developing new cultural structures. Your work is directed to this idea, since your anthologies empower and spread the voices of Black people from different realities, usually out of mainstream art. How do you connect your work to the fight against sexism and racism?
Ooh, okay. I guess, again, it goes back to making these stories available. And then as young people or anybody who reads it, you know, they can see what is happening. Because I guess in terms of sex, well, one thing is getting the works published. Like I said, for a while you saw very few plays produced by women. And that was my whole thing with when I worked with these young men, exiles in South Africa. Everything was told from a South African male perspective. And some of the pieces were sexist. Yes, they were. And then, which really bothered me. So when I went to South Africa, I was determined to find women playwrights. Like I said, I didn't go there with the goal of, oh, I'm going to come back with all these plays by South African women. But I needed to know, what did women have to say in South Africa? And these women talked about how they felt they've been exploited by many of the men, particularly during the apartheid era. They were saying, you know, we did most of the work. And, you know, they would say, like, most of the men during apartheid who were people who were in exile, they went abroad, which is kind of a point, because, like I said, most of the people, the exiles that I worked with in New York, they were men. So they were saying that the men got a chance to go abroad and, you know, do the work that they had to do, where the women were there, you know, doing the large part of the struggle. And so that was a story that needed to be told. And one of the plays, you know, one of the writers write about that. You know, we were here while you were over there. So, like I said, those were stories that needed to be told. And then, you know, many of the women, I'm just thinking about the whole issue of education, how women are denied education over men because they have to stay home and take care of the family, even though these are grown men. So those are stories that you were not hearing in the voices of men. And so that sort of changes the whole dynamics when people think about a group of people, you know, from a particular African culture or tradition or whatever. You know, this is the role of women. So they have a voice. And I think that's very important. And that's what I've been trying to highlight. You know, these are lives of women that we just don't hear about. So when you start talking about, not that I'm trying to, I mean, I'm not consciously thinking of ending sexism or whatever, but I want these women to put it out there and let, you know, everybody else knows this is what's going on with women in these different communities. So like I say, these were stories that were not being told. And I wanted them to be told. And, you know, in terms of racism, you know, the whole, the lynching plays, you know, that really dealt with the whole issue of race in this country, and also how women played a key role in the fight against racism. And a lot of people didn't know that. You know, a lot of people don't know about this woman named Ida B. Well, you know, who wrote like the first book about lynching in America. And lynching wasn't about, you know, what black men weren't lynched because they were accused of raping a white woman. They were being lynched because they were successful in terms of business, and whites did not like that. So those are the kinds of stories that, you know, I'm trying to tell through theater. And that's what those anthologies, you know, are doing. Not just to be read, but to be produced. Like I said, I'm happy to know that, you know, people are discovering Alice Childress and Trouble in Mind and some of her other plays. And, you know, hopefully we'll see a lot of productions of Trouble in Mind post-COVID.
Whoa.
So, yeah.
Well, Kathy, I hope we can find a way to translate your books into Portuguese and other languages, because I think you have a revolutionary work and you are a model for us. It was really, really inspiring listening to you. And do you want to say something else?
I just want to thank you for creating this platform, Artist Science, which I think is wonderful. And I'm looking forward to hearing the other interviews, because you've got people from all over the globe, which is very, very exciting. And I meant to ask you, did you do this as a result of COVID, or you started it before COVID?
Yeah, it was a result for
Of
COVID.
Yes.
We were meeting people from internet and listening people from all around the world saying the same things, that the environment, the society doesn't value art, doesn't understand the value of art, doesn't know what its role. So we decide to dialogue with different fields of knowledge. Because of that, we create this project that is very new. So every comment, every critics, everything we are going to receive with open heart, because we really want to improve it and to dialogue with people from different places. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
It's
and I
very
want to
important.
say I admire the work you do. I mean, for those who don't know, Viviane is a playwright for children, and she has plays that are nonverbal, so, which I find amazing. So, because I'm, you know, I haven't really done a lot of children's theater, but I think the work that you're doing is something that's very needed. And speaking of post-COVID, I'm sure the type of work you're doing is going to be, it can probably be a healing for young people, because I know a lot of young kids are trying to deal with, you know, what is this COVID all about? And so I think your work can be very therapeutic for young people.
Well, I have lots of plays, drama plays, but they are in Portuguese. Because of that, you don't know. I need to translate them into English. I have one translated into Spanish, but maybe I can write some in English also.
Well, you speak English well, so.
Well, you know, I have a challenge for you, maybe a dream. Maybe your next anthology is about the role of race and gender in theater for children. I wish I can help you to do that. I think it's very important nowadays.
Yes.
And
Yes. Okay, we'll talk about it.
let's think about that. Well, Kathy, thank you very much. Please, we want you connected to us all the time, and whatever you have to tell us, we'll be glad to listen to your comments, critics, to your ideas, and well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody out there.
Bye-bye, Kathy.
Bye-bye.
Well, English speakers, now I'm going to speak Portuguese. So if you want to understand that, I would be very glad. Please come to the translation room. Okay? So you are going to understand because we are going to speak about our plans to 2021 year. Ok? Bom, pessoal, esse foi o nosso Arte como Ciência especial, o último do ano de 2020. E agora a gente vai falar um pouco sobre como o Arte como Ciência funciona e fazer algumas previsões de 2021. Então, vou chamar a nossa coordenadora a coordenadora técnica, a Daniela Israel, para conversar um pouco com a gente.
Oi!
Oi, Dani!
Hi! Hi, everybody! It's all my English. E aí, então, Vivi, chegamos ao fim do ano.
Chegamos ao fim do ano com o projeto Arte como Ciência, que foi realizado toda a primeira terça-feira do mês, desde setembro. Tivemos um primeiro encontro contando com várias pessoas de diferentes países, um segundo encontro com a entrevista do Gessé Oliveira, o terceiro foi Richard Serraria e hoje tivemos a Kathy Perkins. E todos esses estão no nosso canal com os melhores momentos, com legendas em inglês. E esse da Kathy Perkins, a Dani vai nos contar agora se ele vai ter também uma versão de melhores momentos ou se vai ter uma versão com legendas em português, que ela ainda não me disse, então conta aí, Dani.
Então, os melhores momentos estão no nosso canal no YouTube, então não aproveita esse momento para dar o link, para dar o curtir ali, dar o joinha para a gente, que é bem importante. A gente vai ter a versão dos melhores momentos da Cat, sim, vamos fazer nosso combinado, né, na terceira terça-feira de dezembro, que deve ser ali quase Natal, Ano Novo, meu aniversário, por aí. E sim, ele vai contar com legendas em português, né, para os falantes de língua portuguesa, e para os falantes de língua inglesa ele vai estar no áudio original, sempre no nosso canal do Arte como Ciência no YouTube.
Sim, a gente falando agora que em 2021 nós vamos ter algumas surpresas, algumas serão anunciadas nos próximos dias, então fiquem ligados na nossa página no Facebook, né? E também vamos continuar com o nosso Arte como Ciência mensal. No entanto, nós vamos mudar o horário, né? A gente andou conversando e achamos que para contemplar mais países, devido à diferença dos fusos horários, a gente vai passar a realizar o Arte como Ciência num horário que no Brasil é mais cedo, que é às 2h30, Dani?
Isso aí, às 2h30, na terça, continuamos sempre na terça, nossas terças-feiras clássicas, mas vamos passar para as 2h30 para poder contemplar, e como a Vivi falou, outros fusos horários. É um horário que a Europa consegue acompanhar, um horário que a América do Norte também consegue acompanhar com mais facilidade, né? A Vivi, para quem não sabe, não está aqui no Brasil também, então ela está madrugando.
Aqui na Noruega é quase meia-noite, né? E então, vários colegas que estão ou na África, né, ou aqui na Europa, esse horário acaba não sendo um horário muito legal. Também para o pessoal dos Estados Unidos vai ser bacana de outros países da América Latina também, vai ficar super bom. E a gente ainda vai achar uma maneira de englobar o mundo inteiro, né? Que essa é a nossa vontade, é dialogar com gente do mundo todo. Então, eu queria falar que a gente ia ter uma palavrinha da nossa coordenadora de comunicação, a Simone Lesch, mas ela acabou ficando sem conexão, então a gente só quer agradecer o trabalho maravilhoso que ela tem feito na nossa divulgação. E vamos falar do primeiro Arte como Ciência, que não vai ser na primeira terça-feira de janeiro, porque, claro, né, estaremos no início do ano. Então, ele vai ser um especial em todos os sentidos, porque vai acontecer no dia 18 de janeiro, eu acredito.
No dia 19 de janeiro.
19 de janeiro.
Então, deixa eu só recapitular aqui, Vivi, rapidinho. A gente posta os melhores momentos da Cat no dia 15 de dezembro, na nossa terça-feira do mês. E a gente vai fazer um mesinho de folga aí para curtir as férias em casa, né? Uma virada de Natal e Ano Novo. E voltamos, então, no dia 19 de janeiro com um especial super internacional que está sendo preparado pelo Clayton, que é o nosso coordenador de tradução solidária, e pela Vivi também, que é o especial Pesquisa nas Artes para a Infância, que é um especial junto do Arte como Ciência com a CITEG.
A CITEG, que é a Associação Internacional de Teatro para a Infância e Juventude. Então, a gente está muito feliz. Eu aqui na Noruega estou fazendo pós-doutorado em teatro para a primeira infância, na Faculdade de Artes e Educação, é o departamento que eu trabalho, né? E então eu estou muito empolgada, porque é um assunto que eu trabalho há quase 20 anos, e o Clayton Echeveste está articulando nomes de todo mundo, nomes super importantes que a gente está conversando e que vão estar aqui para falar das especificidades da arte para a infância em janeiro. Então não perde, né? Queria também fazer um super agradecimento nesse final de ano, né, pela parceria da Paula Cabreira e do Celso Júnior, que estão fazendo um trabalho lindo na tradução solidária, e também a Bárbara Kastner, que fez a tradução para o alemão na live do GC, e hoje a Victoria, que está nos acompanhando aí na equipe técnica.
É isso. Acho que vou fazer os meus agradecimentos para quem está nos assistindo. Nós temos aí espectadores fixos. Agradecemos muito. O projeto é muito importante para a gente. É muito importante ter a presença aí de todo mundo. A gente fica muito feliz. Toda a equipe está se dedicando voluntariamente. Então, faço das minha fala o que a Vivi falou em dobro. Agradeço muito todo mundo. E um feliz ano novo.
E eu queria dizer o seguinte, gente, que como a Dani disse, esse projeto é um projeto colaborativo de pesquisadoras e pesquisadores de diferentes lugares. Então, a gente quer muito escutar as pessoas. A gente quer saber. Vocês têm um comentário? Por favor, mandem para a gente. Vocês têm uma ideia? Mandem para a gente. Tem uma crítica? Maravilha! Manda para a gente. A gente realmente quer construir um trabalho. Como ele está acontecendo? Ele está acontecendo de forma colaborativa, ele está acontecendo com um esforço de pessoas de diferentes lugares, porque a gente realmente acredita que, ao refletir sobre o papel social da arte, sobre a especificidade da arte, além da gente ampliar o nosso próprio conhecimento, a gente contribui com outros campos do saber e também com as políticas culturais, né? Chega desse papo de arte é supérflua, chega dessa, né, que não, tudo bem, é legal, mas a gente tem que priorizar a construção dos presídios, né? Quantos presídios deixariam de ser construídos se a gente tivesse um acesso democrático à criação artística, à apreciação, ao desenvolvimento estético, à consciência que a arte nos propicia. Então, por essa razão, a gente realmente convida as pessoas a participarem, a mandarem suas perguntas, suas sugestões, e no ano que vem a gente vai estar aí de novo, né?
E mandar sugestões pelos nossos canais aqui, então, no nosso site Arte como Ciência, pode entrar lá que tem o nosso e-mail, pode mandar no Instagram Arte como Ciência, mandar um inbox ali que eu e a Vivi coordenamos, então vai estar falando uma forma de falar direto com a gente. pode mandar também pelo Facebook e, claro, pelo YouTube aqui, fazendo comentários nos vídeos também é uma ótima forma da gente ouvir vocês.
Então, queria agradecer mais uma vez a Kathy Perkins e a todo mundo. Thank you very much for your audience. Todas as pessoas que vieram assistir a gente. E até a próxima!